right, you can start my time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly an honor to be before you tonight to examine the teaching of my friend Bishop Hayes. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Thank all the ministers. Some of my friends from Central Arkansas are here tonight. Pastor Jim Frills, one of my friends that pastors in Indiana now. We used to go to church together in Cabot. He's here, and I greatly appreciate that. And I started naming names, and I'm going to forget somebody like I did in the last debate. Totally looked over Pastor Daniel from Jacks Creek, Tennessee, and never lived that one down. But anyway, it's good to be here tonight. Thank you for your attendance in this debate. Real quickly, I want to answer the questions that Bishop Hayes asked me tonight. He said, number one, what is the meaning of power on her head? 1 Corinthians 11:10, it is authority upon her head, and I take that to mean that long hair is a sign of submission to the man, to a husband. Number two, does the covering of 1 Corinthians 11:4 that men are not to have include caps or hats? I said no. Really, that's a moot point because Brother Hayes adamantly declared on his YouTube video that when he's talking about a RAC, he's not talking about a hat. I mean, he goes really into detail on how veils became hats, become a fashion, and then when the fashion of hats left, women left their RACs altogether. And I guess it's an evil and adulterous generation that seeketh after a sign, and he wants me to put this hat on and pray. Listen, I don't wear hats in buildings because a hat is to keep the sun out of your eyes. I don't need a hat in this building. I wear a toboggan in the wintertime, and that's to keep the cold air off the back of my head. When I walk into a building, I take it off because that's not what it's designed for. So I wouldn't have any issue praying with the hat on. I'm not going to put his hat on inside this building, and it's a moot point whatsoever to say, if he doesn't put the hat on and pray, it means he didn't really believe it. No, he does. That's ridiculous. All right, so number three, what is the meaning of come in 1 Corinthians 11? It's long hair, according to Bauer, Art Gingrich, Danker Lexicon. My chart 105, I do want to mention a few things real quick. Brother Hayes' chart number 3 in the definition of his proposition, when he talks about the required covering, he believes that hair is a covering, but the RAC is the required covering. By implication, he's really saying that long hair is not required, that women are not required to have long hair. By implication that the RAC is the required covering, then hair, he's really saying, well, long hair, that's really not required. His chart number 4, he talked about his intentions tonight. He said last night that I threw hermeneutics out the window. Well, Brother Hayes threw the scriptures right out the window. He didn't touch top side, bottom side, inside or outside of any of the scriptures I brought up. He didn't want to talk about the scriptures. What did he want to talk about? Church history. That was the bulk of his negative argument, was church history. So he said that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14 to 15, that's the only place that hair is mentioned. Well, in his definition of his proposition by teach, he mentioned necessary inference. I wonder what it is that's shorn or shaven in verses 5 and 6 in 1 Corinthians 11. Because for a woman to not be covered is identical with being shaven. I wonder what it is that's shaven. Is it hair? I think that it's hair. All right, I want you to notice here at the beginning of my negative speech, I want to focus on a question that I asked Brother Hayes. I asked him, since you teach that head coverings is an exclusively New Testament doctrine, at what point did the apostles begin teaching RACs or veils for women? I gave him several choices. He put D. He said unknown, but before 1 Corinthians 11. Now, the fact that Brother Hayes answered D contradicts some of the statements that he's made in his book and in YouTube videos, where he says that it was Paul who enjoined head coverings or established head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11. Even his proposition says, as taught by Paul. Friends, 1 Corinthians 11 is 20 years after Pentecost. You mean to tell me that something as important as women wearing veils was overlooked by the 12 apostles of the Lamb for over 20 years? I guess all those women in the upper room, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, must have dishonored their heads when they were praying or prophesying, because according to Brother Hayes, it was sometime later on. So you see, friends, Brother Hayes teaches that 1 Corinthians is dealing with a New Testament exclusive doctrine, or what he calls new wineskin, something that has never been taught before. This is the false premise of his entire theology. 1 Corinthians 11 is not a new wineskin. The head covering is simply an expression of headship. Brother Hayes agrees with me on this because he states specifically that the head covering is the object lesson of headship. But headship is not a new doctrine. It's not a new wineskin. Headship is from the beginning. Genesis 3:16, the husband has been the head of the wife ever since the very first husband and wife were created in the Garden of Eden. So since the head covering is an expression of headship, and headship is from the beginning, then 1 Corinthians 11 is not a new wineskin. The head covering issue in headship is based upon the order of creation. Again, not a new wineskin. The head covering issue is taught by nature. Does not even nature teach you if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her instead of a veil. Romans 1:26 through 27 teaches that nature gives a clear distinction between the purpose of man and the purpose of a woman. Nature is not a new wineskin. So Brother Hayes may ask me, when did the apostles begin teaching that women should have long uncut hair? Nature's been teaching that from the beginning. Paul was not introducing a new doctrine or a new wineskin. He was reaffirming that which was established from the beginning and was recognized under the old covenant. Remember, the head covering is the expression of headship, or as Brother Hayes says, it's the object lesson of headship. Headship of the husband over the wife was an established fact in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it was common for men to cut their hair short or to shave their heads. It was viewed as something odd for a man to have long hair in the Old Testament. In contrast, women have always been recognized as having long hair. The Jewish Encyclopedia even states that a woman's hair was never cut except as a sign of mourning or degradation. The priest commonly prayed or prophesied wearing a mitre or a turban on top of their head. It was their RAC. It was a part of their required uniform, and they prayed or prophesied with this thing on top of their head. Brother Hayes introduced the argument that the covering must be a veil, something that can be put on and taken off of the head, because the covering is supposedly only required in the church, or only required when a woman prays or prophesies. First of all, Paul didn't say that. He didn't say that one bit. You can read 1 Corinthians 11:5 from now till Jesus comes, and you're never going to find where Paul said that a woman is to be covered only when she prays or prophesies. That's something that Brother Hayes has got to read into the text. Now watch this. The phrase praying and prophesying is not a conditional clause, meaning that this is the only time that a woman is to be covered, or that this is the only situation in which she dishonors her head by being uncovered. Rather, it is simply an incidental statement, meaning that the statement is accompanying, but not a major part of the passage, or that it is simply something that is liable to happen as a consequence of not being covered. For example, we might say, if a woman runs barefooted, she dishonors her feet. Now, does that mean that she dishonors her feet only when she runs barefooted? Or is it possible that she could dishonor her feet by doing other activities while barefooted? Does that mean that a woman is only required to wear shoes when she's running? Try that the next time you go to a restaurant. So if we take praying and prophesying as a conditional clause, like Brother Hayes does, then what other passages must we view as a conditional clause? How about Mark 11:25? When you stand praying, forgive. Does that mean that the only time we are to forgive is when we are standing praying? If we are sitting down praying, does that mean that we don't have to forgive? What about James 5:13? Is any among you suffering? Let him pray. Does that mean if you're not suffering, you don't have to pray? Let's see, if you're suffering, you can pray. And if you pray, you got to be standing in order to forgive and to be forgiven. These are not conditional clauses. They're incidental statements. Going on, he said, is any cheerful? Let him sing praises. Does that mean if you come to church and you're not cheerful that you can't join in to the worship service? You know that's not the case. Brother Hayes knows that's not the case. These are not conditional clauses. They are incidental statements. Chart 212. Besides this, praying and prophesying are not limited to the church service. 1 Timothy 2:8, Paul said, I would therefore that men pray everywhere, not just the church, but everywhere. In like manner also, women. So prayer for men and women are not limited to the church. Then in Acts 21:8-11, while Paul and his friends were simply lodging in Philip's house, he had 4 daughters that prophesied. A little later on, Agabus comes by for a visit. He says, thus saith the Holy Ghost. No indication that a church service was going on. So the context of 1 Corinthians 11:5-6 is not limited to the time of a church service. I want you to consider this. I want you to consider this and think this through. 1 Timothy 2:8, Paul said, I would therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands in like manner also. So that connects the women to praying everywhere, lifting up holy hands. And everywhere includes the church. It includes everywhere, doesn't it? In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. Notice that. Not with broided hair. Well, why in the world is Paul concerned about a woman's hair during prayer time if supposedly first century Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? Who would have been able to see their hair? How would Paul have known that it was broided? The presence of such a prohibition of this hairstyle argues forcibly that it was in fact being worn in the churches and that it was visibly seen by everyone. This in turn implies that there was not a doctrine of women wearing veils. Otherwise, how would Paul have known that women wore braided hair? And scholars contend that 1 Timothy was written about 10 years after 1 Corinthians, so apparently the women in Ephesus weren't wearing veils covering up their braided hair. Notice the parallel teaching of Peter, written some 13 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. 1 Peter 3:3, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair. And this is once again connected to the context of prayer, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Notice he said the outward adorning. How can plaiting the hair be an outward adorning if supposedly Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? The point is they didn't. If women went around praying with a veil on their head, then the veil would have been their outward adorning, not the plaited hair. It wouldn't be necessary to warn women against a particular hairstyle if their hair was being covered by a shawl or a veil. This shows conclusively that apostolic women were not going around praying while wearing veils. Otherwise, why would there be a prohibition against the outward adorning of plaiting the hair? So Brother Hayes, his explanation of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is, and he put it on one of his charts, if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it's a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her wear a veil. Friends, that is a false antithesis, and he didn't touch any of this last night. It is a false antithesis. There's not equal relationship on both sides of this equation. It's not even similar. It's not even a valid argument. It is totally asinine to say that if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. That makes about as much sense as saying if you don't wear sunglasses, you might as well shave your eyebrows. But since it's a shame to shave your eyebrows, you need to wear sunglasses. Both of those are false antithesis. So let me give you an example of a true antithesis. I mentioned this last night. You'll see what I mean. If you steal a piece of bubble gum, you might as well rob a bank. But since robbing a bank is a felony, don't steal a piece of bubble gum. This is a true antithesis. It has equal relationships on both sides. We're talking about stealing something on both sides of the antithesis. One thing is kind of minor, stealing a piece of bubble gum. The other one is more severe. And Paul's making a logical argument of conclusion. If you're going to do this, well, then you might as well do that. Or we might say, if a woman goes out in public wearing a halter top, well, she might as well go out naked. But since it's a shame to go out in public naked, let her not go out in a halter top. Again, this is a true antithesis because we have an equal relationship on both sides. Partial nudity versus full nudity. It's a valid argument because we're trying to explain why you shouldn't do this based upon the severe act of that. But we have to have equal relationship on both sides. And that is clearly what Paul is discussing in 1 Corinthians 11:6. If a woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it's a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her not cut her hair at all. That is a true antithesis because we have equal relationship on both sides. It's talking about cutting the hair on both sides. Again, Paul's not talking about if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. That's totally asinine. That is a false antithesis. It's illogical. What Paul is saying is that there is only one way, one simple, plain, unambiguous, right way to efface the shame of being shorn, and that is for a woman to have long, uncut hair. We know for sure that a woman is not required to wear a veil because in response to his own rhetorical question as to whether or not it's proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered, Paul clarified that a woman's hair is given to her for a covering, or more specifically, instead of a veil. Most translations simply render 1 Corinthians 11:15 as her hair is given for a covering or as a covering, but these two prepositions in English have a wide semantic range. The preposition used in the Greek text is anti, which refers primarily to a replacement or an exchange, instead of or in place of. In fact, several Bible versions translate this passage this way. For example, the Apostolic Bible Polyglot says, "For the hair of the head instead of a wrap is given to her." The Aramaic Bible in plain English states, "Because her hair is given to her in place of a covering." The New International Standard Version says, "Since the hair is given as a substitute for coverings." The Darby translation has, "For the long hair is given to her in lieu of a veil." The Orthodox Jewish Bible has, "Because the long hair has been given to her instead of the kerchief or head covering." R.A. Knox translation of the Vulgate, that because of her hair has been given to take the place of a veil. So you see, nothing in the passage says anything about nature giving woman an example of why they should wear a veil. In fact, the opposite is true. The passage teaches that nature has given woman a long hair instead of or to take the place of the veil. I want you to see exactly what Paul said and compare it to what Brother Hayes says. Brother Hayes wrote in his book, "But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory unto her because the hair in the place of a veil is given to her." Now Paul said that. That's pretty plain to understand, but I want you to notice what Brother Hayes says. Brother Hayes interprets this passage as, just as the hair represents her proper covering in the natural realm, so the veil in the Christian woman's proper liturgical covering in the spiritual realm. Notice carefully the difference between what Paul said and what Brother Hayes said. Paul said one thing is given in the place of another thing. Brother Hayes says just as one thing is given, so also another thing is given. But that's not what Paul said. Notice very carefully, there is no just as statement. There are just as statements made all throughout the New Testament. Just as Moses lifted up the snake, so also the Son of Man will be lifted up. Just as Jonah was a sign, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation. Now, Paul used it in 2 Corinthians 1 and 5. He used this just as kathos hutos statement, "For as the suffering of Christ overflow to us, so our comfort overflows through Christ." But you know one place that Paul did not use a just as argument? That's right, 1 Corinthians 11:15. There is no just as one thing is given, so also another thing is given. What Paul said is long hair is given instead of or in the place of another. When A